Well, good afternoon, everyone. Very warm welcome to you all for this free webinar on blame culture, the causes, the consequences, and more importantly, how we go about preventing it. This is getting towards the end of our 2016 free webinar program. The 2017 program will be out soon. It's amazing how quickly time flies, but as you can see, productive sessions up until this one. And judging by the number of people calling in, clearly this is also an area of great interest to you all. Usual points to note, everyone, short and sharp, 30 minutes long. For those of you unable to dial in that have registered, you can access the recording and the slides after this event. And please share this widely with as many of your colleagues as possible for reasons that we will discuss later. Certainly, in my experience, and I've spent a lot of time in different companies around the world through this year and many years before, blame culture is becoming more and more of a challenge for many organizations. So the more people that know about this, know about the causes, so there is an awareness of the causes so that we can prevent them, and importantly, actions to take in the event of having a blame culture. The more people that know about it, the more enjoyable the workplace is. If you need any more information, as always, ladies and gentlemen, please, as many of you do, just drop me an email on this email address, and I'll get back to you as I always do. I always welcome feedback on these sessions because it's only your feedback that we actually improve. And please follow me, as always, on LinkedIn. I've just put a post up on complexity and simplification. I did a post a few months ago on blame culture. I think it was entitled Kill Blame Before It Kills You. So the intention of the post on LinkedIn, as indeed the free webinar program, is to really provide you with information that's free, but information importantly that helps your life and helps simplify your life professionally and personally. For those of you don't know me, I'm Martin Lush. I'm president of the Health Sciences Pharma Biotech Division of NSF Health Sciences. NSF is a not-for-profit organization that is really focused on one thing, and that is improving global health. So I have colleagues working very hard in our food division to do that, colleagues working in our Pharma Biotech division and medical device division, our food supplements division, all with the objective of doing our very best to help improve the health of people around the world. For me, in particular, I have 35 years leadership experience in the pharmaceutical and healthcare industry, and it's that experience that really got me interested and fascinated in blame cultures. I've suffered, as I would imagine most of you have, from blame cultures. I think I've been very lucky, in fact, in my career that suffering has been minimal relative to many others, because I've certainly witnessed considerably more blame cultures than I've actually experienced. For those of us who have, and for those of you in the room, because I know lots of you dial in with a conference call facility, so you've got lots of people listening in on this. Just ask everybody, what does it feel like? What does it feel like to work in a culture where there is an underlying theme of blame? The one word that I think summarizes how it feels like is the word toxic. It's like a circular firing squad. Nobody wins. Everybody ends up being a victim. And that word toxic is apt because when you have a blame culture, everyone loses. There are no winners. The impact is massive. Blame kills creativity at a time we need it most. Blame kills problem solving when we need to be fixing problems so they don't happen again. Blame certainly kills teamwork because nobody trusts anybody. blame kills communication because you don't want to say the wrong thing. It certainly kills fun, that's for sure. And ultimately, it ends up killing organizations. So where there is a blame culture, nobody wins in the long term. Often there are short-term minimal gains, but certainly not worth the sacrifice of killing creativity, killing teamwork, killing communication, killing fun, because frankly, if we're not enjoying our work, at least most of the time, something is wrong. With all of those killing effects of blame culture, you're left wondering, well, why the heck is it so prevalent? It's interesting, on courses, we run a lot of courses on human error, causes and prevention. On these courses, we summarize the top 10 best-in-class practices that really tell us how those companies that have really removed human error, driven down human error to very, very small levels, what do they actually do? And we actually summarize on our course the top 10 practices. Number one of which is, in all of these organizations that really succeed in driving continuous improvement, they all, without exception, have a blame culture, blame-free culture. And on these courses, we ask our delegates to assess their own companies against each of the top 10 practices. And rather of great concern to us, is that one of the areas that scores low on most occasions is the one relating to blame-free culture. So many companies don't have that. So many companies suffer from that. But why? When the killing effects are so tragic, why is it we actually tolerate blame? One of the challenges for us all is that we're surrounded by it. You only need to read newspapers, you only need to listen to the news. When something goes wrong in our society, the first question that the media is asking for is who's accountable. In other words, who is to blame? And that's partly because we live in what is called the just society. When something goes wrong, somebody is held to account, whether it be sinking of the Titanic, whether it be the space shuttle disaster, and all of these where individuals were blamed, you found a blame culture. So the fact that we're surrounded by our appetite for blaming people, blaming organizations when things go wrong, it's understandable, I guess, that is transferred into the working environment. Because society teaches us that when something goes wrong, someone has to pay. But life isn't quite that simple, thankfully. As Matthew Syed said in his book entitled Black Box Thinking, and I love this quote, blame is a way of collapsing a complex event into a simple solution. It was your fault. But as we all know, it isn't quite that simple. On sessions before, when we talked about human error, causes and prevention, one thing that we at NSF constantly emphasize is what we call the error chain. So many companies still talk about root cause. There is no such thing as a single root cause. And when something goes wrong, it is the consequence of multiple, what we call contributing factors, multiple links in this error chain. So when there is human failure or a human error on the surface of the problem, that so often results in that individual, that operator, who are trying to do their best most of the time, being blamed. When in fact, the contributing factors that need to be addressed are those that sit below the surface of the problem, whether it be the complexity of processes, systems and procedures, whether it be the underpinning culture driven by the leadership style within the organization. So the reality is that when errors happen, it's not as simple as blaming people. If we're serious about preventing it from happening again, if we're genuinely serious about driving continuous improvement, and with it reducing risk, all of those are win-win. We have to be serious about fixing the underlying causes of the problem. What I want to do in this short session, ladies and gentlemen, is to really take what is a fairly nebulous subject for many and provide you each with some simple rules, some simple tools and techniques. I've called it the 6 to Fix rules that you can remember and you can directly apply in your given situation. So often when I talk to people in organizations, often under a huge amount of pressure, when we talk about blame culture, the response I so often get is, well, Martin, we can't influence this. We can't change this. It's the way it is. It's the culture of the company. It's just the way that it is. Well, I don't accept that. You individually, most of you have responsibility for leading teams, whether it be in labs, whether it be in production, QA, QC, whether it be in warehouses. And you as the supervisor, you as the leader have a responsibility to ensure the opposite of a blame culture exists, a culture where there is transparency, excellent communications, where people actually enjoy working. That is ultimately your responsibility. Now, I know that often the way your business is run, often the measures you're asked to perform against do create a blame culture, and you can't influence them. But the point of these 6 to Fix is to focus on what you can influence. Starts off with number 1, and I'll go through each of these in more detail as we go through. But in summary, number 1 is re-emphasizing what I've just said. It starts with you. You've got to learn to manage your chimp. For those of you that participated in the webinar on risk-based decision-making, you will know exactly what I mean by that. For those of you that didn't, I will introduce you to your chimp and give you some tools and techniques to manage the chimp. I want you to also think error chain, because once we have that picture in our mind of not a single person making a mistake, but actually a series of contributing factors that had nothing to do with that person, as soon as we accept that model, we start to think more about the systems and far less about the people. Number 3, I want you to adopt what I call black box thinking. That's not my term. I've stolen it from Matthew Said. We'll talk a little bit about that later. Number 4 is about good communication and presence. Number 5, making sure that measures, and we all suffer, many of us, from death by measure, but the measures that we choose, and measures are a fact of life. It is the old saying, what gets measured gets done, but those measures have to drive the right behavior. And we've covered that on a previous webinar. We'll summarize it here again because it's really, really important. And number 6 is really, really key, is to remain hyper-vigilant. What I mean by that is that you can work incredibly hard to remove a blame culture, maybe the product of or the byproduct of your predecessor. You can work incredibly hard to remove that. And if you're not careful, that blame culture can return within hours just because of poor decision making or a change in circumstances. So we have to, once we've worked really hard, and it is hard work, to remain hypervigilant, because if you don't, then the blame culture you've removed can come back very, very quickly. So let's start off with number 1 of our 6 to Fix. How do we prevent blame culture? Well, we prevent it by controlling our emotions. I can vividly remember some years ago I sat around the dinner table with my daughter. My daughter at the time was struggling with maths. One of the reasons she was struggling with maths was because of the ineptitude of her teacher at the time. So it was kind of a hot topic in our family. And I can remember over dinner saying to my daughter, how did maths go today? And she said, well, Dad, we didn't do any. I said, well, what do you mean you didn't do any? Well, the teacher did his emails and we sat colouring in. At that point, I went crazy. I went nuts. And I suddenly realised that I was going crazy and I was going nuts at the wrong person. All my daughter was telling me was the truth. But my chimp reaction, my immediate reaction was directed towards her. And then I suddenly realized that, you know what, as a consequence of that, I've probably set up unintentionally, driven by genuine care and love, a blame culture. Because next time I ask her, how did maths go, she isn't going to tell me the truth. Because the last time she told me the truth, she got all the heat. This is an example of chimp management. And as we covered, please, if you didn't participate in the last session on decision making under pressure, please go back to that webinar where we describe the importance of chimp management, which is another way of saying control your emotions. When there's an input, a stimulus, a situation, the first part of the brain to be activated quite literally in a millisecond is what we call the amygdala. It's the reptilian part of the brain that has become known as the chimp brain. Now, the chimp brain exists for one reason and one reason only, and that is to protect you and I. So it drives our fight, flight, that's run away, or freeze response. So the chimp brain, this fight, flight, freeze, very emotional part of the brain, is always engaged first. And the human brain, where there is more logic, reason, and structured analysis of the situation, is always engaged far later. So everything goes through the chimp. Now, the importance of this is really creating the space. When a stimulus occurs, the bigger the space between that event and your response, the more measured the response. So the bigger that gap, you start to use the human part of the brain where the logical analysis takes place. You use the computer brain where we draw upon our knowledge and our experience rather than going straight for the emotion. So the bigger the space between that pressurized situation and your response, the more measured and less emotional that response. But the reason I'm spending time on this, ladies and gentlemen, is that so often blame cultures can be created by an over-emotional response to a given situation. I'll give you an example. I remember my production days at AstraZeneca coming back from a really tough production planning meeting where people took great pleasure in telling me how bad my plant had been performing and why couldn't I manufacture a product like everybody else, etc., etc., etc. So I came away from this meeting sort of feeling pretty beaten up, pretty stressed. And I walked into my office and there was a knock on the door and one of my operators walked in. And we did have a genuinely open, genuinely transparent culture. You know, my attitude has always been, guys, if there's a problem, I need to know about it, then we can fix it. The door is always open, etc., etc. You've heard all of these words before. But at that particular time, in my particular emotional state, when the operator said, Martin, I've just dropped the flask of product, well, I went crazy. I went nuts. I can't repeat the language I used because this would be censored. As soon as I said it, as soon as the chimp brain had said its piece, I knew I got it so wrong. That operator turned around, walked out the door. He went straight into the coffee room, who had listened to this abuse that this operator had received, product of my chimp brain. I walked into the tea room and I started to apologize profusely. I started to really say, look, I'm really, really sorry. I didn't mean it to come out that way. And as much as they said, it was okay, Martin, the reality was that all of those months taken creating that environment of trust, that environment of transparency, that culture of openness was almost totally destroyed in the space of 2 minutes of my chimp brain running amok. So this is really, really key because, as I said earlier, you can work so hard to create an environment that is transparent, where there is freedom to speak, where there is genuinely low levels of blame because there are high levels of trust. All of that can be really destroyed within seconds because we haven't created the space between that stimulus, I've dropped the flask, to the response. On reflection, I should have taken a deep breath, should have said to the operator, John, just tell me a little more. How did it happen? And that would have suddenly made me realize that actually it was not him, it was the system, it was the complexity of the task that we'd asked him to do, and so on and so forth. So creating that space, managing that chimp is really, really key at a personal level, because when we manage that chimp, we manage our emotions, and when we manage those emotions, we are fairly confident then that we can not use the language that so often leaves people feeling as if they were blamed. So that's number one, manage your chimp. Number two is think error chain. Matthew Said, as we said earlier, said blame is really a consequence of oversimplifying, collapsing a complex situation. It's far easier to say you were at fault, it's your fault, it was human error, than to actually step back and admit that it was the system, it was complexity, the company culture, the style of leadership, all of which are really, really tough to deal with, but nonetheless, if we want to move forward and progress, they do need to be dealt with. So number two is remember error chain. Don't collapse a complex problem. Ask why. Some people use the 5 whys. Whatever you use to create that space between stimulus and response, think error chain. Think about, look, if somebody has made a mistake here, if we've had a warning letter, or we've had a recall, or we've had a customer complaint, don't think about the person. Focus on the system that that person was asked to operate. Very few people get out of bed in the morning and say to themselves they're going to screw up. When mistakes happen, they happen for a reason. And most people I've certainly worked with, all they want to do is the best they can with what they have available. And often what they have available is a load of rubbish, and they do the best they can under really, really difficult conditions and difficult circumstances. So, number one, manage your chimp. Number two, don't allow yourself to collapse a complex problem. When you don't allow yourself to collapse a complex problem, you focus more on the systems and the procedures and practices and less on the people. Number three, adopt black box thinking. I'm not on a retainer for Matthew Said either, but I've read his book. It's a fascinating book. It's a book that really forces you to rethink problems and mistakes. It forces us all to view problems and mistakes as learning opportunities, as catalysts for continuous improvement. Solutions are just waiting to be discovered in that moment a mistake happens. And as I said earlier, most people do the best they can with what they've got. So when errors and mistakes happen, and they often create that high tension, that emotion, that stress that fuels that chimp to respond in the way that I described earlier, once that is allowed to happen, that feeling of blame starts to permeate through your department, through your organization. So one way of stopping that is to really adopt the black box thinking. The term black box really comes from what the aviation industry has done. We all know every aeroplane is a black box. So Matthew Syed has used that to describe the positive attitude to errors and mistakes, because the aviation industry has made itself one of the safest forms of travel, if not the safest forms of travel, because of its ability to learn from mistakes, hence the term black box thinking. So number one, remember, is manage your chimp. Number two, don't allow yourself to collapse a complex problem into blaming an individual, focusing more on the systems than the person. And number three, very closely linked, is by forcing ourselves to view problems and mistakes as learning opportunities, we actually are far more likely to maintain, if not enhance, that feeling of transparency, that feeling of openness, than anything else. I was at a privilege to be part of a global presentation with one of our clients probably about 8 months ago. There were 400 or 500 people sat in the audience. The CEO stood up, said good morning to everybody, and then he asked a particular lady, and this is a packing supervisor, to stand up, and you can imagine how nervous this particular individual was. Cut a long story short, this lady had picked up a defect on a packing line. And I still remember quite vividly the words of the CEO. He said, "I'd like to thank you on behalf of everybody for saving a product recall by virtue of your actions." His words did more for transparency and blame-free than anything else, because what it signaled to everybody is that when mistakes happen, let's be transparent and honest and bring them to the surface, and then we can deal with them rather than the opposite, which is to hide them. So number three, view problems very, very differently. Number four, communication and presence. What I mean by this is that I know how busy you all are. When I was in industry all those years ago, it was not uncommon for leaders, supervisors to be spending 60%, sometimes 70% of their time on the production floor, in the warehouse. In other words, at the sharp end where the work was being done. So they were available, they had presence, they could get a sense of how things were going, but they could also ensure that good communication, excellence in communication was taking place. As we've become busier, not necessarily in a good way either, that presence, that availability of supervisors and of leaders on the shop floor has been drastically reduced. That in itself has reduced the quality of communication. And in the absence, when there is poor communication, it creates a vacuum. And that is filled by gossip, it's filled by rumors, it's filled by fear. So poor communication is often the cause of blame culture, the unintended consequence, if you like, of poor communication. Only recruit, if you can, only recruit emotionally intelligent leaders. What do I mean by emotionally intelligent? Well, that's a difficult one. It's having that natural empathy, that natural care for people they are responsible for. Frankly, if you don't have those qualities, in my books, you shouldn't be responsible for leading people. You're probably going to cause more damage than good. You can train those qualities in. It's difficult. It's far easier in the recruitment process to ensure that those that do have those responsibilities are naturally caring of their people, in other words, more emotionally intelligent. And please remember, you can never over-communicate. And communication is not email, it's face-to-face whenever possible. And please be aware of cultural differences. You know, I spent a lot of time working in India and China, where there are saving face cultures, where admitting a mistake is even more painful than it is in Western cultures. So that cultural awareness needs to be very acute. Number 5, measures that drive the right behavior. Make sure you select them. We did a session, a webinar a few months ago, where I really emphasized this point strongly. Before you choose a measure, think about the behavior you want to drive, not choose the measure and then be surprised by the behavior that you get. Unfortunately, one of the causes I see of blame culture, unintentional consequences, is down to the performance measures chosen. So an example would be, deviation management, 30-day performance measure for completion, or to measure people by reducing the numbers of their deviation incidents. Those are measures that drive, in my mind, the wrong behaviors, because those drive behaviors of hiding. They are telling people that problems are bad. They lead to under-investigation. They lead often to mistakes and errors not being fully investigated. So measures must drive the right behavior. And finally, number 6, I love pictures of meerkats. Meerkats are famous for lots of things, their community, how they look after each other in particular. And whenever you see films of meerkats, you always see one standing guard while the others are either playing or feeding. This is what I mean by being hypervigilant. Driving out culture, a culture of blame is hard work. Maintaining that culture of transparency, open and honesty cannot be taken for granted. Because when the pressure is on, this is when it's more likely to come back. When you have a bad inspection, when you've rejected a very expensive batch, when there's a change of boss, when communication is suffering, when you have new supervisors, or where you have the chimp screaming, blame somebody at you, rather than fixing the underlying problems. So please, please remain hypervigilant. I know it from experience that once you've worked really hard to create a culture of trust, openness, and transparency, it's really, really easy for that to be taken away from you because of the pressure that gives the chimp a voice. So, your 6 to fix, we'll come back to them very quickly in a minute. Look forward to seeing you, everybody, on the 21st of November. We'll talk about resiliency. That very well-known management guru, Mike Tyson, had a very famous quote: "We can all have a great plan until somebody breaks your nose." What I mean by that, in this turbulent world that we all live in, that's only going to get more turbulent, we're going to have plenty of people punching us. And our survival as individuals and as businesses depends on our ability to take those punches, those surprise blows, and to actually get up stronger than we were before. So that's the subject of our next webinar on the 21st of November. So I sincerely hope you can join me for that one. And I leave you with this, your 6 to fix rules, ladies and gentlemen, for working hard to keep blame at bay and replace it and ensure that it stays a culture of transparency and honesty and an environment where people can solve problems, feel free to be creative, work well as a team, and ultimately enjoy what they're doing. So remember, it starts with you. Manage your chimp. Don't collapse a complex problem. Think error chain. Change mindsets when it comes to problems. Adopt the black box thinking. Problems are a catalyst for continuous improvement. Don't underestimate the value, the essential value of excellent communications and being present. Only measure that, choose your measures that drive the right behavior. So often the measures create unintentionally the blame. And once you've done all 5, please, please remain hypervigilant. So, Thank you once again for listening and for supporting these. If you do have any questions, please get back to me. I always answer them straight away. Please keep in touch via telephone, email. Please follow me on LinkedIn. I've just done a post on the problem we all suffer with complexity, the paralysis by over-complexity. So please take a read, have a read of that. It's designed to help you simplify not just your life at work, but life at home as well. So have a read. Let me know what you think, and I look forward to seeing you all once again later in November. Thank you very much, everyone.